All right, everybody, let's get started. So welcome to this Fireside Chat with Peter Bickel. So maybe I'll give, well, Peter really needs no introduction, but I mean, let me do it anyway. So Peter is a emeritus professor of statistics here at UC Berkeley. He's had incredibly deep contributions to many different fields over the years. So it includes non-parametric statistics, semi-parametric statistics, focusing on things like bootstrap, robust statistics, high-dimensional statistics, comp bio, and on and on and on. He is no stranger to Simons Institute. Just a couple of years ago, there was a special workshop here in honor of his 80th birthday. And I mean, maybe it should be no surprise at all that he's basically won like every award there is for anyone to win in statistics. But what was pretty cool for me finding out this morning is that, you know, I mean, perhaps you have heard of the COPS Award, which is a very important prize in statistics. Well, he was the first winner of the COPS Award. And I mean, even if you haven't heard of the COPS Award, you've probably heard of a MacArthur Award. He was in the 4th class of MacArthur fellows. So yeah, during this fireside chat, the plan is to kind of, you know, be very casual, ask him about his thoughts on machine learning, reflections over his career about various things. It'll be moderated by myself and Haiyan Huang, who is the current chair of the statistics department at Berkeley and has collaborated with Peter for quite some time. So yeah, in the spirit of fireside chat, we'll have this in the background while we talk, and we have refreshments for ourselves. So maybe Haiyan and I can just say a little bit about to start the theme off, like of how we first met Peter. I mean, our stories are of course very different. So I met Peter when I was a PhD student here, and actually in my second year as a PhD student, my advisor Martin Wainwright went on sabbatical, sort of unannounced to many of us in the group, and you know, I went from meeting him once a week to having like nobody all of a sudden, and I was too shy to ask him to meet over Skype. So then I was thinking, like, you know, I would really like to talk to somebody. What should I do? And I talked to an older, wiser statistician, my father, and he said, email Peter. He's always been very kind to me. So I sent an email to Peter and I said, you may know me, I'm one of the statistics students. And I was just wondering if I could talk to you about research and maybe, like, you know, have a little bit of direction. So we met once a week for about 2 months. We talked about independent component analysis. It didn't lead to any kind of research collaboration, but I mean, Peter was indeed very kind to me. So that's how I first met Peter. Haiyan?
So, I'm Haiyan Huang. I'm a professor in the Berkeley Statistics Department, and it has been a great fortune for me to be a colleague and also one of Peter's long-term collaborators over the past 20 years. And I have to say that it has been an amazingly enriching experience for me to work alongside Peter, both personally and also professionally. And I'm always telling my students, like, you know, if you have statistical question, whatever, go to Peter. Peter is like a library, you know, for statistics. He knows the concepts, knows the story, knows the background, knows the history. He's amazing, you know, in terms of, you know, her role, you know, in the statistics field. So I feel really happy, you know, today to have this opportunity to have this chat, you know, with Peter and together with Po-Ling. So thank you both, you know, for this.
Oh, I guess I have to answer.
Well,
I feel like I'm a lamb in the slaughter. Well, thank you very much, and well, they're exaggerating, but you can ask whatever you wish.
Okay, well, I mean, the
grossly exaggerated.
No, these are all factual statements.
Well, yeah, but
you were my mentor, you know, for my career.
Well, that's true. Well, you enabled me to get into computational biology, but so that's made a big difference.
Yeah, so we just thought we would start with the question about, can you tell us all sort of the story? How did you find your way to statistics? And I mean, kind of relating that to the present day, if you were an undergraduate or graduate student now, do you think you would still decide to study statistics or something else?
Okay, that's a fair question. Like most of the people, first of all, you should all know, if you don't already, that I'm 84 years old. So I've been around for a while. And in my generation, people just went into statistics by accident. Statistics hardly existed, right? And I was originally actually for a couple of years an undergraduate at Caltech, and I wanted to do physics, and I found that my three-dimensional intuition wasn't good enough, and so and also I hated Caltech. That's a different matter. So I transferred to Berkeley, and then I found that I could graduate in 1 year after a couple of years, if I got into math. I got into math, and then I had lots of prerequisites that I had to take. And one of the prerequisites I thought might be useful and interesting would be statistics. Then I took a class from a man named Joe Hodges, who has been gone for a long time. And Joe, this was an undergraduate class, but he went like the wind. And he attracted me to the field. I mean, that was just the way it was. And then I stayed and took a master's, and then went on to the PhD program, and wanted to work with Joe, but then he only wanted people who brought their own problems. And at that time I was, 17, 18 or something. Well, that's an exaggeration, 19. I was not really ready to think about my own problems. But he directed me to his longtime collaborator, Eric Lehman, who's Hodges and Lehman goes together, if you've seen articles in statistics. And so I worked with Eric, which was a great experience. He was a wonderful mentor, and I learned an enormous amount from him. And so I just drifted, and it turned out that statistics fit me just right, because it was a mix of mathematics, but also trying to direct mathematics to the outside world and use it in the outside world. And in a way, that's what I think physics is in part is also, at least for theoreticians. And Eric himself, as it turned out, had wanted to be a logician, but then Jerzy Neyman, who was his advisor, who was one of the founders of the field, I think steered him into statistics through a teaching assistantship. Anyway, so it's a drift. Now, what I would advise a student of today, well, first of all, I think statistics is only a small part now of a much larger enterprise. And it's a buzzword, of course, data science. I think information science is a much better buzzword, but nevertheless, the fact that one can bring mathematics, computation, and large data resources together to have a major effect, well, that would thrill me. It's thrilled me now, and I think it would thrill me then too. And so I could see myself going into computer science, statistics, computational biology, any of those fields. So that's answer question one.
Yeah, so thank you so much for sharing. And those remarkable individuals, who had an impact.
I should mention, since if you want to talk about individuals, two other individuals who had perhaps a bigger impact on my thought than others, and one was Luciana Kam, and the other was Peter Huber, who was one of the founders of robust statistics.
Can you elaborate a bit more on, how did they influence you?
Peter? Well, we were in a we were in a program at Princeton, which was the Princeton Robustness Year. So that included Peter and David Andrews, or Don Andrews from Toronto actually, and Frank Hampel, and of course John Tukey, who presided over it all. And I got to talk more with Peter. Actually, he'd been at Berkeley before, and I just found his approach to statistics and robustness appealing, and it made sense. Lucian was really, I think, a very remarkable individual, somewhat underappreciated, and he was, in some ways, he was so theoretical that I didn't understand him most of the time. I don't think most people did, but he could go from enormous abstraction to very concrete examples. So for example, to give you an instance for those of you who know this, the enormous abstraction, I started to take a course in decision theory from him, and dealing with Banach spaces or something like that. That was not what he wanted. He wanted L and M spaces. That was the proper setting, he felt, for statistics. and anyway, but he had a well, he did old-fashioned asymptotics, although really it was just as minimax as anything that's done today. But he had a very deep and broad view of the field as it would develop, actually.
Thank you, Peter. And as we talk about the influence over time, so there is another major factor comes to mind, and that's also related to the theme of the Simons Institute. So that's the developments in computation.
Okay.
So how have the developments in computation over the years impacted your research? And have these tools played a role in your theoretical work or influenced the types of problems you choose to work on?
It certainly influences greatly. Unfortunately, I never liked coding. So I never got substantially into actually doing computing. Luckily, some of my students could, but indirectly. So, for example, I've been interested in lots of things connected with the bootstrap, the M out of N bootstrap, Richardson extrapolation, various things which, in fact, bore on being able to do computations with the same amount of resources more efficiently. And I've always been interested, but more as an outsider from the field of computer science, certainly.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Shifting the gears a little bit. So like, what papers are you most proud of?
Well,
I know what the most enjoyable to write and why they are so meaningful.
They're not necessarily the ones that have been the most influential in any way. Actually, the paper that, in a way, was the first, in fact, for a long time, my only applied paper, was a paper called Sex Bias in Graduate Admissions at Berkeley, which was a paper which appeared in Science, a review article in Science. It was, in fact, really originated from the dean of the graduate division, who was a demographer. But at that time, I didn't know any statistics, really. And I suddenly recognized something which I had learned theoretically as being the source of a dilemma that he faced with me with. Well, some of you may have encountered that example, but it's basically, this was a time when the federal government was really going after universities to make sure that there was a little discrimination and to foster larger participation of women and minorities in schools. And Hamill, the lead author really, decided to try to be prepared. And so he had access to data from the university. And so he made a little table of male, female, admit, deny, minority, also non-minority, admit, deny. There were too few minority students at the time to get any conclusions. But the table seemed to clearly indicate a very strong bias in favor of men. Okay, well, but as some of you may know, or most of you may know, admissions at Berkeley are, in fact, on a departmental level. They're not on a university level. And so he went around making the same kind of table, department by department, to see, where were the guilty departments? And he couldn't find them. He absolutely couldn't find them. And he told me this and asked me what was happening. And I suddenly realized, you can see that how abstractly I was trained, that really conditional independence and independence are not the same thing. And then I discovered there's a name for this in statistics. It's called Simpson's paradox. And so then I ended up rediscovering some tests that people had before. And indeed, what happened was that the explanation of the phenomenon was the departments that were hardest to get into at the time were the departments that women tended to go to, namely English, history, and the humanities departments. The science departments are not that hard to get into, and that's where the men, on the whole, gravitated. And the rates of admission were different as a consequence, right? More people were admitted in the science departments than in the, and indeed, when you started to look at the individual tables, that came out. So that ended up being the explanation. It was a lot of fun, that particular thing. And as it turned out, as a final point of curiosity, we then started to look at past data, and what the admission situation had been in the past, and we found no evidence of bias in favor of men until about a year or two earlier, when there was evidence of bias starting in favor of women. And that coincided, of course, with when the federal government started to press, correctly, universities to be more open. Anyway, so that's the story. Otherwise, I guess I've played a reasonable role in semi-parametric theory, which has now become a major part of causality, if you want. And I'm pretty proud of that. And sort of odd things, an extension of the Smirnov test to more than one dimension from a permutation perspective, so that one had to do weak convergence of sampling from finite population, empirical processes, and things like that. So I would say that on the whole, the papers that I'm proudest of, most interested in, are the ones where I feel I really learned something new. Anyway.
Yeah, so I wanted to ask you about your thoughts on robustness. I mean, I didn't realize this at the time when I was a grad student because I wasn't studying robustness. But of course, once I started working on robust statistics, I realized that your name was all over many corners of this.
Yeah.
So I was just wondering, now that robustness has sort of taken off again, right? What are your views on the current state, right? I mean, do we need to keep looking at different types of contaminations and attacks to be robust to, like, how much should we be pushing this area theoretically?
I think it's an area that it's something that always has to be kept in mind. Robustness and stability, the fact that that models are creatures of ours, they're not creatures of nature. And since they're creatures of ours, we always have to be on guard whether we're really not grossly wrong in our assumptions, and therefore we'll be also grossly wrong in our conclusions. So I think it's always an important subject. The difference, I think, between past analyses of robustness is that the focus has been on very high dimension and adversarial things. But in a way, it's not that different, actually, I think, because minimax theorem, for example, Lecomte's work was always stated in terms of min-max theorems, but they were min-max theorems with relation to parametric models. So what are parametric models? They're basically, if one wants to go to within the general IID space, parametric models are simply low-dimensional manifolds, essentially sitting in IID space. And so all the conclusions, it wasn't that one did only asymptotics as opposed to finite bounds. It's that they were all results which were for smaller neighborhoods. And whether that's necessarily wrong or to be discarded, I'm not sure about, because min-max in these very large spaces corresponds to always, pretty much, to situations which are at the border of the set. Situations which may be somewhat implausible. Whereas if you're dealing with a finite dimensional parametric model, they're always on the inside. They tend to be in the interior. And so you can do more analysis. So I'm not really answering your question, but but I do think it's maybe this is just a message. It's worth considering local analyses, partly because you can do them in much greater detail, and because they can also give you some more understanding. I mean, like the whole Huber story came from, you might say, it's contamination with an arbitrary non-parametric model, but really the story is about Gaussian plus a fixed direction, plus fixed arbitrary directions. So it's a parametric model again. And from that fell out this very nice idea that, which is actually turns out to be equivalent. Soft thresholding and Huber's estimate are really the same thing, or duals of each other.
Maybe one follow-up question on robustness. So, I mean, we had discussed in brainstorming this of like, I mentioned test time versus training time robustness, and you said you had to look that up. So in the machine learning world, there's a lot about adversarial examples people have seen.
Yeah, I looked that up a bit. I'm not so sure the difference is that sharp, because, for example, now thinking back to the talk you gave, you had the Gaussian sample, right? And this adversarial construction. Well, you can sort of think of it also. You have this empirical distribution, which is the Gaussian sample. And then you pick a contamination distribution, which is dependent on your empirical distribution. Well, if the sample is large, it's almost the same as saying that you have contamination with a fixed distribution. Fixed unknown distribution. Right? Because after all, if the sample is large, you just see something Gaussian, so that you don't necessarily pick the distribution. You can't pick the distribution that precisely. The other thing is, of course, is the question is how much contamination. If the contamination is of the order of epsilon n, as you have, then you have the kind of results that you've talked about. If you say that contamination is of the order of 1/√n, which means that your bias and variance are of the same order, then you're again actually led into the Huber type of robustness. I think even there, I'm not sure. This is something that would be interesting. If that would also be true with adversarial.
Yeah. Yeah, this naturally also relates to, Peter, your contributions to encode. So like one method you proposed is the non-parametric one to help to generate the p-values, for some statistics summarized from DNA sequences, but that is able to really consider the local structures, of the DNA sequences, in some way, right? And another contribution you made to encode is, to produce a method, to evaluate the reproducibility of the findings.
Yeah.
And that was a really critical one at that time in that consortium, because in that consortium is involving, multiple computational biology groups. They are producing different, methods to detect, some kind of signals. But those signals may not be agreeing with each other.
No.
And which method we want to use, how to evaluate those. And Peter, and all together, with, the whole team, the statistical team, Peter is leading, was able to produce a method that becomes a standard one used by the ENCODE consortium, to measure the reproducibility of the results and to help select which method is a good one. So a lot of kind of the ideas mentioned in the discussion about the robust statistics were part of the development of those methods. Yeah. And so Peter, I want to ask you, based on your experience with ENCODE, how significant or important do you think for a statistician to be involved in large collaborative, initiatives like that?
I think it's very important.
Yeah.
But I also, I'm not sure that one has to think of it as statisticians. I mean, I think the whole course of, I would think, what attracted me to this conference actually, and is the fact that scientific exploration is a very complex thing, and by now it involves computational aspects, wet lab, many things which go together. And so people work at the frontiers of fields. And so I think statistical training is very good for that, because in a way, statistics has always been a transfer science. You pick up some methodology in one field, which turns out to be useful in other fields. So I do think it's, but I mean, I'm talking about statisticians, data scientists. Obviously, computer science has as much to give, and people can be computer scientists and statisticians and biologists at the same time.
So maybe without making those distinctions, right? I guess the next question is, what do you see as the role of theoreticians in modern AI?
That's an interesting question. I think theoreticians always play an important role, obviously, since I view myself primarily as a theoretician. But in a way, I really like the physics model a lot. And I was for a while, for my sins, dean of physical sciences, and so I had somewhat closer contact with the physics department. And there, theoreticians and applied physicists tend to go together. I mean, there's much more interplay between them, and both sides recognize the importance of the efforts of the other. I mean, things now are so complex that if you go in without some sort of previous idea of what structures you're looking for, I think it's sort of hopeless. I mean, you get garbage. And theoreticians who know techniques for organizing, if you want, information and structuring it, play a critical role in directing efforts.
How about specifically in LLMs? What do you feel?
Well, it's interesting. I mean, I really love this lecture which preceded mine. And in fact, I have to admit, I think I agree with the speaker that things may be leveling off, although my knowledge of it is, because I somehow think the model of the LLM itself, this business of simply being a little bit like a classifier, but using, basing oneself on very, very long bits of information and then producing the right bit of information, is somehow not the way that I think reinforcement learning somehow mimics more how we humans think than LLMs. And so I found it very interesting to hear this semi-skeptical talk about LLMs from the founder of a company. And in general, actually, I'll take, I don't know how much time I have, or we have. Oh, not this all. I was going to, I think the thing that I've been, well, the reason that I came to this conference was that I'm very interested in the parallels between human thinking and AI. Because in fact, I think we don't really understand how humans think either. And and there are various things that I wonder, which, parallels, which, I mean, it's actually way beyond, I think, where one is now. But for instance, I think all of you who have been engaged in research in any way whatsoever, and in whatever field, have encountered what I guess in math has sometimes been known as the aha moment, right? Where you've been working on something for a long time, and suddenly you see, right? And then you proceed to try to fill in the gaps. I mean, it's by no means a deductive science, as we know. Science does not proceed deductively; it proceeds inductively. And so the aha moment, there's a book which I would recommend, an old book called The Psychology of Invention in the Mathematical Field by a man named Hadamard, Jacques Hadamard, whom you may have encountered with Hadamard matrices, etc. And what he did is he talked to his various colleagues in Paris at the time and asked them how did they think about mathematics? How did they invent? And the thing that somehow sticks in my mind is one of the very great mathematicians, Henri Poincaré, said, well, you know, the idea of Fuchsian functions came to me as I stepped on an omnibus in Coutances. All of a sudden, he'd been thinking about this for quite a while, and there it came to him. And that, I don't know what the parallel would be in machine learning and AI. I mean, does one observe phenomena where all of a sudden, right, the LLM jumps? They never jump. Yeah, okay. Fair enough.
Do you have any interesting aha moment stories?
Yes, but nothing of that striking nature. Well, I think with the sex bias in graduate admissions, I actually had an aha moment very early on in my career. But otherwise, with various things, usually under pressure, I suddenly would see things that I should have seen earlier, like Edgeworth expansions. I was asked to give a talk, and for a long time, my ideas were completely wrong, and I knew that I wouldn't have anything to say. And then suddenly I realized that you could generalize in a rather crude way the Bayesian bound to U statistics. But so yes.
So now we think about statistics and AI. So what do you think are the most important open questions in statistics that need to be tackled in the next maybe 5 or 10 or 20 years? Are they or are not they related to machine learning and AI?
Well, I think you know, whatever one does, right, one has to work with greater computational power. Statistics per se, I think, perhaps its old role, if one sticks to just statistics, of being primarily evaluative, right? Being able to measure how much confidence you have in your conclusions, since your conclusions are always, you know, not, you may think they're sure, but there's usually some shadow of doubt. That's, I think, really very important. The other role that I think, and that, you know, there's, for example, a lot of emphasis, perhaps too much emphasis on things like the false discovery rate, and oh, blast it, I always forget it. The new business with putting conformal, and that's it. Right, which talking to a colleague who works in a bank, and I did some collaboration with, because that's really not useful for them. What they want, of course, is conditional given X, not things being averaged over all possible X. So that's one thing. The other thing, so I view this as stopping moves in false directions, and that's an essential part of science. Because, I mean, we've seen it in practice, right, with the reproducibility crisis of a few years ago, which probably is continuing. But the other thing is also that as it's not only computation, sensing, there are all sorts of things that are developing. They all lead to often lead to completely new types of data. The new types of data need new models, new analysis, new types of inference. That, I think, is very important and continues to be important. But my ideal is really that of people who try to spread out, who don't consider themselves just statisticians or just computer scientists, but.
Can you tell us about a problem that you're personally most interested in right now?
Well, as I think I've hinted at it already. I'm just I can't really contribute to it because, first of all, I found that I can't compute anymore, but also, but it's become really more important is trying to learn as much as possible about parallels between human thinking and what's known about human thought and about AI and so on. The other thing is, of course, again, given my age, I try to keep my mind moving, and so I do work on small math problems which arise, not necessarily often unsuccessfully, but actually as a consequence of a Simons conference some time ago, I started to work on a conjecture that I almost worked on, of Blackwell's, that I almost worked on for my thesis, but I didn't, fortunately, because it was only solved 40 years later. But which I keep on thinking I've gotten, but I'm still not quite sure. Anyway, but I would say the main thing is trying to understand different aspects of the science of thought, if you want. In that respect, actually, previous speaker, Jimmy, what's his last name? Ba, was it? Right. So Jimmy Ba was talking about again, GLMs, and I've been playing with ChatGPT-4, and I've had sort of interesting experiences with it, which again, they're nothing statistical, but they suggest that it's possible failing. So an early one was of the type that everybody has noted, that I asked it whether, first of all, I was interested in two fields, independent component analysis and factor analysis. These are two fields that appeared in different parts of statistics, one in the social sciences and one in the physical sciences. But in fact, they actually deal with the same question. But so I asked ChatGPT to tell me references, what would be recent references for independent component analysis in the physics and engineering literature and in the social science and literature. And physics and engineering, it was just fine. It gave me perfectly reasonable answers. And in social science, it's basically yes. Maybe I've gotten this slightly backwards, but I think the point in the end will be clear. I asked it the same question about factor analysis in the social sciences and in the physical and engineering sciences. And then I asked about ICA in the social sciences, independent components. And what I got back was something which looked suspiciously like what it had produced for the physical engineering sciences. And at the end, there was a little comment. And the comment is, this is what the list would have looked like had this work been done in social science. The other experience, which was in a way worse, because here at least one knew what was dealing with, was I tried to look for any references on the effect of particular genes on behavior. And it sent me to a particular gene, right? And I then asked it for references. And the only reference it produced was a paper arguing on the basis of data that in fact all the previous literature, which seemed to indicate that this gene had been of importance in various small samples of patients, was not. The evidence was weak. And I kept on asking it for more references. It kept on giving me this reference as a positive reference.
All right. Well, I think that's probably all.
Yeah.
Okay. All right. Yeah.
Yes.
Well, okay. Does anyone from the audience have a question? Maybe we can take one or two. Nadi.
So one one thing, even in my very limited and much shorter window, the change I've noticed has been a huge increase in definitely the rate of publications, just the number of papers published per any time unit, and also the number of papers published by any person in any time unit, and also maybe in the pace of research, although that's a bit harder to tell. I'm curious what your thoughts are on, is that a good thing, a healthy thing? What would you also advise both the students and maybe the non-students here regarding that?
Well, advice, of course, is useless in this case because the question what the culture is, right? And the culture, but it's interesting to trace the culture. So I remember once at the start of my career, Peter Huber telling me about his thesis advisor. He wrote a thesis in algebraic geometry, which actually is the theorem is still known. And his advisor, who is faculty at the ETH, said, "You shall not publish more than one paper per year." Right? But the implication being that it should be a good one. And it's certainly been true that in statistics and mathematics, certainly, and statistics has on the whole, for a long time, pursued the math trajectory. CS, for some reason, I think, has always emphasized the conference format, which has great advantages because you can get quick publication and quick reactions. On the other hand, it does lead, it seems to me, to an excess of papers. And an excess has its own dangers, right? Because then you don't know what to look for. Eventually, I think the archive is, I think, a marvelous invention because archive actually enables a paper to sort of float to the top because of various people finding it interesting. Of course, there are lots of things which may be mistaken, but then there are also lots of things which are mistaken in published papers. So in the end, I think, anyway, it's whatever the advice is, whatever fosters the research enterprise more, leads to fewer dead ends. And maybe you can't, these are sort of two types of error two types of goods that may conflict with each other. That would be ideal. Yes.
I was curious about your opinion about causal inference or statistics in economics.
Well, that's two different things, right? Statistics and economics is econometrics, which is, I think, really statistics and has the pluses and minuses of statistics in general. Causal inference, I think, is, on the one hand, it was actually in some ways started by somebody I knew early on, Jamie Robbins, and who used to visit David Friedman here often, and David and I had worked together. And it was important because it pointed to the fact that, which people had really forgotten, that correlation and causation were not the same thing, right? So, or you could view it another way, that when you want to extrapolate to a different regime, the conclusions, associations in one regime don't necessarily carry over to another. So that was important. On the other hand, the other aspect, and that's now become a reigning paradigm. For a long time, it wasn't, to the difference between the two and pursuing causes. But what I find not so attractive about it is the emphasis on single causes, because I don't believe in most cases there is a single cause. But what it's really looking for is the causes that are important in the sense that they enable us to manipulate something, to predict something. So that's my reaction. Yes.
Is it on? Yeah, okay, very good. So I actually have a little spicy question.
I'm sorry.
Okay. I have a right, exactly the reaction. What is a good theorem, in your opinion, in a field like machine learning that that I think it is really now driven by empirical evidence, and you know, there are like all sorts of theoretical work, but what would be a good theorem in your mind that you know, that can bring any kind of like enlightenment, right?
Well, I don't think it's limited to machine learning. The same thing applies to statistics and other fields as well. A theorem which surprises, where the conclusion is somewhat unexpected. And those are very rare, actually. Also, theorems which somehow link different parts of the field. I mean, I guess I'm you know, the ideal is something like the Langlands conjecture in mathematics. You know, you have some huge field, one part of mathematics which was conjectured to map onto, in some ways, a completely different part of mathematics. I think initially it was harmonic analysis and number theory. And in fact, some relations were found, and this is a continuing focus in math.
So I'm a computer scientist, and in computer science, we typically deal with data. But when you are looking at decision making, which is what the real world is often about, we have to look at evidence and not just data. So there is this transition. And when we transition from data to evidence, we get into these sort of questions whether evidences are supportive or they're contradictory or they're partially overlapping and so on and so forth. So in computer science, we had once upon a time some work in this area, demonstrative shaper theory and things like that, but sort of petered out. They're not part of modern machine learning. People don't think in those terms. In statistics, have you guys thought about this? What is the state of the affairs there?
Well, you mean, I'm not sure that I'm answering that question. Certainly statistics is about trying to make statements about the weight of the evidence. And you make the statements on the basis of the data that you have. However, any such statement, whether in any field, is always bounded by assumptions. Even in computer science, right? I mean, well, I think for a long time, people just talked about IID samples. Well, samples are not IID. The question is, are they far enough from being IID to matter? So I don't know. It's making it. I mean, I think statistics is all about trying to make that quantitative. It's very difficult.
Are there theories that can help us reason that say, or even represent conflicting evidence? In computer science, it's very ad hoc, mostly.
Well, can you?
But that's not computer science.
Yeah, well, I put it that way. I'm not sure. At least nothing comes to mind immediately, though I'm sure that I'm probably just blanking on it. But I mean, the evidence has to have relative weight. I mean, I think in a case like that, somehow one has to have a back and forth. You have to have, one side criticizing the other side, because presumably the evidence is contrasting because there are groups which believe in one and believe in the other as being more important. And I think the only way that kind of thing can be resolved is really maybe not quantitative.
Right. I think that's all we have time for. So thank you so much, Peter, for all of your time and your wisdom and spending the afternoon with us.
And then we'll have Thanks.